I spent 12 years as a Wisconsin DNR park ranger in the Chequamegon Nicolet National Forest, living alone in a state cabin near Drummond, where the roads turned to gravel and then to dirt, and finally to nothing but 2-track trails that disappeared into stands of white pine and paper birch. The work suited me in ways that office jobs never could. Daily patrols through sections of forest most people would never see, maintenance on trail markers and fire breaks, the occasional search and rescue when some weekend warrior from Milwaukee got turned around chasing after a trophy buck. I kept to myself mostly, which wasn't hard when your nearest neighbor lived 8 miles down a seasonal road that became impassable from November through April. My supervisor, Janet Holloway, ran the district office from Hayward and mostly left me alone as long as my reports came in on time and I didn't shoot anything I wasn't supposed to. We had a rhythm worked out over the years. She'd call every Tuesday morning to check in. I'd give her the week's highlights. She'd remind me that humans needed social interaction. I'd tell her I got plenty talking to hikers and fishermen. It was comfortable in the way that well-worn boots are comfortable. Nothing exciting, but nothing that pinched either. When my uncle died that March and left me his hunting cabin, I saw it as a sign that maybe I should stop renting from the state and actually put down real roots. The cabin sat 40 miles deeper into the North Woods, backing onto federal land with no other structures for miles in any direction, except for an old Norwegian Lutheran church somewhere on the adjacent parcel, abandoned decades ago. Uncle Ray had mentioned it once, said the congregation had died off in the 60s, and nature had been reclaiming the building ever since. I'd never found it, never looked. Uncle Ray had built it himself back in the 70s, one of those off-grid setups that the old-timers favored. Well water, propane heat, generator for electricity when you needed it. He'd been up there every November for deer season until the cancer got him, and in his will he'd left it to me with a note that said I was the only one in the family who wouldn't sell it to developers. I started driving out there on weekends, taking the state truck when I could justify it as patrol extension, using my own beat-up Ford Ranger when I couldn't. The cabin needed work. The roof leaked in 3 places. Brush had grown up around the foundation until you could barely see the structure from 20 feet away, and the well pump made grinding noises that suggested it was maybe a month away from dying completely. But the bones were good. Solid log construction that had weathered 40 Wisconsin winters without shifting, and the location was exactly the kind of isolated that I'd always found peaceful rather than threatening. I'd packed a lunch that first Saturday in late September, drove the 3-hour route north and east from Drummond, turned onto the seasonal road that would close with the first heavy snow, and bounced along for another 45 minutes until I reached the 2-track that led to the cabin. The forest pressed in close on both sides, mostly second-growth hardwood with scattered pine, the understory thick with ferns and wild raspberry bushes that would tear. Birds called from the canopy overhead, chickadees and nuthatches, the harsh cry of a blue jay somewhere to the south. I could hear the wind moving through the pine branches, that particular whisper rush sound that pine needles make. A woodpecker drummed against dead wood, the rapid-fire percussion echoing through the trees. These were the sounds I'd grown up with, the soundtrack of northern Wisconsin that some people found lonely, but I'd always considered companionable. I spent that day and the next dozen weekends working on the place, establishing a routine that felt good in my hands and back. I'd arrive around 10 in the morning, work until the lights started failing around 6, then drive back to Drummond with sawdust in my hair and the satisfied ache of physical labor in my shoulders. I replaced the roof section by section, tearing off the old asphalt shingles and laying down new ones while keeping one eye on the weather. I cleared brush with a machete and chainsaw, opening up sight lines around the cabin the way Uncle Ray had kept them. I pulled the well pump, found the seals had rotted through, and installed a new one that drew clear, cold water that tasted faintly of iron and stone. The work was meditative, the kind of repetitive physical activity that let my mind wander while my hands stayed busy. I'd think about maybe putting in solar panels come spring. Wondered if I could afford to retire early from the DNR and just live up here full time. Maybe pick up some contract work as a wilderness guide or hunting consultant. The cabin was paid for, the land was mine outright, and my needs had never been expensive. It seemed possible in those early weeks, seemed like a life I could build with my own 2 hands. Janet called me on a Tuesday in early October, the routine check-in that had been happening every week for the past 6 years. I took the call standing in my Drummond cabin's kitchen, looking out at the birch trees that had started turning gold at the edges. "How's the Hermit Kingdom?" she asked, her voice carrying that mix of affection and concern that had become familiar over the years. "Quiet," I said, which was always true. "Had a group of kayakers get themselves stuck on a sandbar in the Chippewa River. Took 4 hours to haul them out." "City people," she said, and I could hear her shaking her head. "You get them educated on proper planning." I told them to check water levels before launching. Whether they'll remember next time is anybody's guess. There was a pause, and then she said, "You still spending every weekend at that cabin?" "Most of them. Why?" "Because you're already isolated out there, Lachlan. You keep going deeper into the woods. One of these days you're going to forget how to talk to humans entirely." I smiled at that, though she couldn't see it. I talked to humans. Talked to those kayakers for 4 hours straight. That's called rescue operations, not socializing. She sighed, the sound crackling slightly over the connection. "When's the last time you went into town for something other than supplies?" I thought about it and couldn't come up with a recent answer. "I'm fine, Janet. The cabin's coming together nice. You should drive out sometime, see what I've done with the place." "Maybe I will," she said, though we both knew she wouldn't. Janet was a woods person too, but her woods had cell phone reception and paved roads within shouting distance. "Just don't go full Ted Kaczynski on me, okay? I don't want to have to explain to the higher-ups why one of my rangers built a shack and started writing manifestos." "I'll keep my manifestos to myself," I promised, and she laughed and told me to file my reports on time, and hung up. The deer stopped moving through the clearing that weekend. I noticed because I'd been documenting a small herd for a habitat assessment report, photographing the same 8 does and their fawns that fed on the clover and wildflowers growing where Uncle Ray had kept the brush cleared. They'd show up like clockwork around dusk, emerging from the tree line to the south, feeding for 30 or 40 minutes before disappearing back into the forest. I had 2 weeks of photos showing their patterns, their behaviors, the way the fawns were losing their spots as they grew. That Saturday in late October, they didn't come. I sat on the cabin's front step from 5:30 until full dark, camera ready, watching the clearing where they should have been. The light faded from gold to orange, to that deep purple that comes just before true darkness, and the clearing stayed empty. Not just empty of deer, empty of everything. No rabbits browsing at the forest edge. No grouse picking through the fallen leaves. No squirrels chattering their territorial disputes. I told myself they'd just found better feeding elsewhere, that the patterns had shifted like they sometimes did. But something about the emptiness bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The forest felt different. The quality of the silence changed somehow. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that silence wasn't really silence. There were always sounds if you listened. The small movements of animals and birds, the rustle of wind through leaves, the creak of branches settling. This was different. This was the held breath quiet that comes before storms. Except the sky was clear and the barometer reading I'd checked that morning showed stable pressure. The songbirds went silent over that weekend. Not the gradual departure of migration, but an abrupt absence that I noticed Sunday morning when I woke to the wrongness of it. I'd fallen asleep to chickadees calling, their two-note song filtering through the cabin's thin walls, and woken to nothing. No dawn chorus, no territorial disputes, no feeding calls. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking up into the branches where I'd seen nuthatches and woodpeckers the week before, and found the trees empty. Not just empty, abandoned, like something had driven them away. I spent that morning trying to rationalize it. Sharp-shinned hawks sometimes moved through and scattered the songbirds, but that was temporary, a few hours at most. Disease could wipe out populations, but it happened gradually, birds disappearing over weeks as the illness spread. This was different. This felt deliberate, like something had come through and cleared the forest of anything small and vulnerable. The tracks appeared near the well on Monday morning when I drove back up to finish installing the new gutters. I almost missed them because I wasn't looking down. Was focused on unloading supplies from the truck bed, but something made me glance at the soft earth near the pump house. The prints were fresh, pressed into mud that had been damp with morning dew, and they stopped me cold. Canine, or something close to canine, but wrong in ways that made my ranger's eye twitch with the impossibility of it. 5 toes instead of 4, splayed out like fingers. The pad shape was distorted, elongated, with a heel impression that suggested weight distribution completely wrong for a quadruped. The stride length made me walk backward, measuring the distance from one print to the next. 40 inches, maybe 42. No wolf or coyote could match that. No dog I'd ever encountered. And the prints themselves were huge, easily 6 inches across, pressed deep into the mud with the weight of something massive. I took photographs from multiple angles, using a dollar bill for scale reference the way I'd been trained. I measured the depth of the impressions, calculated the weight they suggested, upward of 300 pounds, probably more. I followed the trail around the cabin's perimeter, watching how the prints circled the structure in a deliberate pattern, pausing at each window, each door, like something had been testing for entry points. My hands weren't quite steady when I uploaded the photos to my laptop and emailed them to Marcus Chen, a wildlife biologist I'd trained with at the state university. I kept the message casual, just said I'd found some unusual tracks and wanted his professional opinion. Didn't mention the unease that had settled into my chest like a cold stone. He called me back that evening while I was driving south toward Drummond, his voice crackling over the truck's speakers. "Where'd you find these?" My uncle's old cabin up past the Chequamegon boundary. You recognize them." There was a pause, and I could hear him clicking through the photos. Could be a deformed wolf. See how the toes are splayed? That happens sometimes with genetic abnormalities, particularly in isolated populations. The stride length is weird, but if it's got a hip injury or something wrong with its gait mechanics, could be, I said, though the explanation felt thin. Other possibility is a bear with some kind of foot trauma. They'll walk semi-upright sometimes, especially if they've got an injury that makes four-legged locomotion painful. That would explain the weight distribution being off. "Bear," I repeated, trying the word on for size. "Yeah, maybe." "You sound skeptical." "Just seems wrong somehow. The pattern, the spacing, and there's no other sign, no scat, no claw marks on trees, nothing but these prints." Marcus made a thoughtful sound. "Well, keep documenting if you see more. But honestly, Lachlan, it's probably just an injured predator passing through. We get weird tracks all the time that turn out to be normal animals doing abnormal things." I thanked him and ended the call, but his explanation sat uneasily in my mind as I drove through the darkening forest. An injured animal, maybe. A deformity, possibly. But neither of those explanations addressed the thing that bothered me most. The deliberateness of the pattern, the way the tracks circled the cabin like something had been studying it, learning its layout, testing for weaknesses. I stopped at a gas station in winter before heading back to Drummond, one of those places that served as grocery store and hunting supply depot and local gathering point all at once, the kind of establishment where the coffee was always burnt and the conversation always turned to whoever wasn't present to defend themselves. I needed fuel and maybe some human contact that would make the tracks at the cabin seem less ominous in the retelling. Ray Kowalski was behind the counter, 60-something with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors before his knees gave out and forced him inside. He'd guided hunters through these woods for 30 years and knew the wildlife better than most biologists. "Lachlan," he said, nodding, as I brought my coffee to the register. "Haven't seen you in a while. Heard about your uncle. Sorry for your loss." "Appreciate it." I pulled out my phone, brought up the clearest photo of the tracks. "Hey Ray, you ever seen prints like these?" He took the phone, squinting at the screen, then reached under the counter for his reading glasses. His expression shifted as he studied the image, forehead creasing. "Where'd you find these?" "Up at Uncle Ray's cabin. They were circling the well house." He zoomed in, examining the toe placement, the pad shape. "Huh, that's something." He handed the phone back. "Could be a black bear with some kind of foot issue. Sometimes they'll walk upright if they've got injuries, throws their gait all to hell." It was almost exactly what Marcus had said, but hearing it again didn't make it more convincing. The stride length was over 40 inches. Ray whistled low. "Big bear, then. We've got some bruisers up in the federal lands. Fellow shot one last season, went close to 500 pounds. He rang up my coffee, bagged it. "I wouldn't worry too much. Bear's probably just passing through, looking for a den site before the snow comes." "Right," I said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced either. "Makes sense." "You carrying when you're up there?" "Always." "Good. Keep doing that." He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Your uncle spent a lot of time alone in those woods. Sometimes the isolation plays tricks on you. Makes normal things seem strange. You know what I mean?" I did, though. I didn't particularly appreciate the implication that I was losing my grip on reality. I'm fine, Ray. Just wanted a second opinion on the tracks. Sure, sure. He waved a hand dismissively. Just saying, being alone out there, it changes how you see things. Your uncle used to tell me stories about the sounds he'd hear at night. Convinced himself there was all kinds of weird shit wandering around. But he always came back down. Always turned out fine. I thanked him for the coffee and advice I hadn't asked for. Headed back to my truck feeling more unsettled than before. The problem with asking questions was that the answers sometimes made things worse. Particularly when the answers were just polite versions of you're imagining things. Janet called the next Tuesday right on schedule, and I almost didn't mention the tracks. But I'd filed my weekly report and included a note about unusual wildlife activity in my patrol sector, which meant she'd see it anyway. So what's this about strange tracks? She asked after the usual pleasantries. Probably nothing. Found some canine prints up at the cabin that looked a bit off. Sent photos to Marcus Chen. He thinks it's an injured wolf or maybe a bear with some kind of deformity. But you don't think so? I paused, measuring my words. Janet and I had worked together long enough that she could read the silences between what I said. I think there's something moving through that area. The deer have cleared out completely. Songbirds are gone. It's quiet in a way that feels wrong. Quiet how? Just quiet. Empty. Like everything with sense enough to run has already left. She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her typing, probably pulling up my report on her screen. You filed this under routine patrol observations. This doesn't sound routine, because I don't know what it is. Could be normal predator behavior, seasonal population shifts. I'm probably reading too much into it. Are you? Her voice had that careful quality she used when she was worried about one of her rangers. Because you sound rattled, Lachlan. That's not like you. I'm fine, I said, which was becoming my standard response to everyone's concern. Just being thorough. Better to document and have it turn out to be nothing than miss something significant. Okay. She didn't sound convinced. But if this keeps bothering you, maybe take a few weekends off from the cabin work. Come back to it when you're fresh. Sometimes we get tunnel vision when we're too focused on one thing. It was good advice delivered kindly, and it annoyed me more than Ray's implications had, because both of them were suggesting the same thing. That the problem was in my head rather than in the forest. That isolation was making me paranoid. That I needed to spend more time around people and less time alone with my thoughts. I told Janet I'd consider it, filed the rest of my report, and spent the remainder of that week trying to focus on my regular duties. But my mind kept drifting back to those tracks, to the silence, to the empty clearing where the deer should have been. Something was wrong up there. Something that defied the neat explanations everyone kept offering me. And the more I tried to convince myself otherwise, the more certain I became that whatever had left those prints was still there, still circling, still watching. The weekend came, and I told myself I wasn't going back to the cabin, that I'd take Janet's advice and give it a rest. I made it until Saturday morning before I loaded the truck with supplies and headed north, unable to shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished, some answer hanging in the forest, waiting to be found. The light was failing by the time I reached the cabin. That particular quality of October dusk that comes on fast and heavy in the North Woods. I'd spent longer than planned working on the gutters, my hands clumsy with cold as I secured the last section of aluminum to the fascia board. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon, and the wind carried the smell of coming snow, that particular mineral scent that meant the season was turning. I was carrying a toolbox back to the truck when I saw them, eyes watching from the tree line to the north. Amber in the truck's headlights, positioned maybe 30 yards out, unblinking and steady. They caught the light and held it, reflecting back with an intensity that made my hands freeze on the toolbox handle. Not the green eyeshine of wolves, which I'd seen countless times during night patrols. Not the white of deer or the red of raccoons. These burned like heated brass, like something molten and aware. And they were wrong, positioned too high off the ground, 7 feet at least, maybe more. No wolf stood that tall. No bear, not on all fours. I stood there in the growing darkness, truck lights cutting white columns through the trees, and watched those eyes watch me back. My heart hammered against my ribs with a primal fear response that bypassed rational thought entirely. Every instinct I possessed screamed that I was being evaluated, measured, that something was deciding whether I was prey or threat, or something else entirely. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just held position with an unnatural stillness that nothing living should maintain. And I could see nothing else. No body, no shape, just those burning amber circles suspended in the darkness like they'd been cut from the fabric of reality itself. I don't know how long I stood there. Could have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Time had that elastic quality that comes with fear, stretching and compressing until chronology became meaningless. My breath clouded in the cold air. My fingers ached where they gripped the toolbox. And those eyes never wavered, never shifted, just burned and burned in the darkness beyond the headlight's reach. Then they were gone. Not slowly, not turning away like an animal losing interest. Just gone like someone had flipped a switch and cut their power. The darkness where they'd been looked the same as the darkness everywhere else, and I was left standing in my truck's lights with a toolbox in my hands and the absolute certainty that I'd seen something that shouldn't exist. I dropped the toolbox. Actually dropped it. Let it fall from nerveless fingers to hit the ground with a metallic crash that shattered the silence. The sound broke whatever paralysis had held me, and I moved. Grabbed the toolbox, threw it in the truck bed, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the tailgate latch. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being wanted to get in that truck and drive, until the forest couldn't reach me anymore. But I made myself stop. Made myself look back at the tree line where those eyes had been. The headlights showed nothing but pine trunks and underbrush, the normal components of northern Wisconsin forest. No shape, no movement, no sign that anything had ever been there. Bear, I said out loud, testing the word against what I'd seen. Just a bear standing on its hind legs. Light hit its eyes weird. But bears didn't stand 7 feet tall. Bears' eyes didn't reflect amber in headlights. And bears sure as hell didn't maintain that kind of unblinking stillness, that predatory assessment that spoke of intelligence and intention. I got in the truck, locked the doors, something I'd never done at the cabin before, and sat there with the engine running and the heater blasting cold air that would eventually warm. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My breath came fast and shallow. And I could still see those eyes in my mind, could still feel the weight of that stare, like physical pressure against my chest. I should have driven away right then, should have headed back to Drummond and let whatever was out there have the cabin, the forest, the entire goddamn Northwoods if it wanted. But I didn't. Because running meant accepting what I'd seen, meant acknowledging that something impossible had just watched me from the tree line. And acceptance would come with questions I didn't have answers for, implications I wasn't ready to face. So I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, until my breathing normalized, until I could convince myself that I'd seen an injured bear or a trick of the light or anything other than what my instincts insisted it had been. Then I drove home through darkness that felt heavier than it should, more substantial, like the forest itself had thickened into something that pressed against the truck's windows. I didn't tell anyone about the eyes. Not Janet during our Tuesday call. Not Marcus when he emailed to ask if I'd seen any more unusual tracks. Because telling meant speaking it into reality, meant making it real in a way that keeping silent somehow prevented. I filed my reports, did my patrols, and tried to focus on the routine tasks that had always grounded me. But the eyes stayed with me, burned into my memory like an afterimage. I'd see them when I closed my eyes at night, would startle awake, convinced that something was watching through my bedroom window. I started keeping the curtains closed, even during the day, started checking the locks 3 and 4 times before bed, started sleeping with my service weapon on the nightstand within easy reach. The rational part of my mind knew this was escalating, knew that I was displaying classic anxiety behaviors that suggested I needed to talk to someone, maybe even see a professional. But the deeper part, the part that had evolved over millions of years to recognize predators, insisted that the anxiety was justified, that something was wrong and my body knew it, even if my mind couldn't accept it. I stayed away from the cabin for 2 weeks, told myself I was taking Janet's advice, giving myself space. But really, I was afraid to go back, afraid of what I might see, afraid that those eyes would be there again. And this time I wouldn't be able to convince myself they were anything other than what they were. The 3rd week I broke. Drove up on Saturday morning with sunshine streaming through the truck windows and NPR playing softly on the radio, everything so normal and mundane that the fear seemed ridiculous in retrospect. I'd spooked myself, let isolation and stress amplify something ordinary into something threatening. Ray had been right about the woods playing tricks. I just needed to prove to myself that there was nothing there, nothing to fear, nothing but trees and animals and the comfortable solitude I'd always valued. I worked through the afternoon, finishing the gutter installation, patching a section of roof where water had been seeping through during the October rains. The physical labor felt good, focused my mind on concrete problems with clear solutions. I could hear birds calling from the forest, not the abundance from before, but enough to suggest that whatever had scattered them was gone. A red squirrel chattered at me from a white pine, annoyed by my presence. Normal forest sounds, normal forest life. The light was fading again when I climbed down from the roof, joints stiff from hours of crawling around on shingles. The sun had set behind the western tree line, turning the sky that deep purple blue that comes just before full darkness. I was gathering tools, getting ready to pack up and head back to Drummond when something made me look up. It stood at the forest edge maybe 50 yards to the north, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Massive shoulders, wrong proportions, a shape that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. The head was too large, too angular, held high on a neck that suggested an upright stance despite the digitigrade legs I could barely make out. Arms hung too long from those shoulders, ending in hands I couldn't see clearly but could sense, could feel the weight of even at this distance. I froze with a hammer in one hand and a bag of roofing nails in the other, every muscle locked in place as my brain tried to process what my eyes were reporting. Not a bear. Bears didn't stand like that, didn't have that silhouette, didn't possess shoulders that wide or heads that shape. Not a person in some elaborate costume. The proportions were wrong, too large, too alien. It just stood there watching me, perfectly still except for a slight movement that might have been breathing. I couldn't see its eyes in the gloom, but I could feel them on me, could sense the attention focused in my direction with that same assessing quality I'd felt before. The weight of that stare made my skin crawl, raised every hair on my arms and neck. The silhouette shifted slightly, head tilting in a gesture that seemed almost curious. The movement was wrong, too fluid, too controlled. Whatever this was possessed a body awareness that suggested intelligence, purpose, an understanding of its own presence in space. I should have moved, should have run for the truck, should have at least backed away toward some semblance of safety, but I couldn't. Fear had paralyzed me as completely as those eyes had 2 weeks ago, left me standing in the gathering darkness with tools in my hands and the absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The moment stretched, seconds becoming something outside normal chronology. The thing stood there. I stood here. The space between us felt charged with potential, with the possibility of movement that would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium held us both in place. Then it moved, not toward me. That would have broken me entirely, sent me running regardless of paralysis. It moved sideways, crossing from one section of tree line to another. And in that motion I saw how it walked, upright, fully bipedal, with a loping gait that covered ground with terrible efficiency. The digitigrade legs gave it a spring, a coiled power that suggested explosive speed if it chose to use it. It disappeared into the trees to the east, swallowed by darkness and pine branches, and I was left standing alone in the clearing with my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. This time I didn't try to rationalize what I'd seen. Didn't tell myself it was a bear or a person or a trick of the light. Because this time I'd seen enough to know that none of those explanations held water, that what I'd witnessed was something outside the boundaries of what should be possible. I got in the truck with shaking hands, locked the doors, started the engine with 3 tries because I kept fumbling the key. The headlights cut across the clearing, illuminating nothing but grass and disturbed earth where I'd been working. Whatever had been there was gone now, had melted into the forest, like it had never existed at all. But it had existed. I'd seen it, had watched it move, with that terrible fluidity that spoke of muscle and sinew and predatory awareness. And as I backed the truck around, heading for the 2-track that would lead to the seasonal road that would eventually lead to pavement and civilization and lights, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd seen something that would change everything. I drove too fast over the rutted track, the truck bouncing hard enough to rattle my teeth, not caring about the suspension or the paint job or anything except putting distance between myself and that clearing. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, and I kept checking the rear view mirror, expecting to see it there, following, keeping pace with mechanical efficiency. But the mirror showed only darkness and the red glow of my taillights reflecting off disturbed dust. Whatever it was had let me leave, had watched me drive away without pursuit, without challenge, and that was somehow worse than if it had chased me because it suggested choice, decision, a calculation about my value that I couldn't begin to understand. The thought made my stomach clench, made the fear that had been sharp and immediate transform into something deeper and more pervasive. This wasn't random. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct or hunger. This was deliberate, intentional, an intelligence that had evaluated me and made a decision I didn't understand. I hit the seasonal road doing 40, fish-tailed slightly on the loose gravel, corrected with an overcorrection that nearly put me into the ditch. Slow down, I told myself. Last thing I needed was to wreck the truck and have to walk back to the cabin for help. Because that's where I'd have to go. There was no cell signal out here, no other cabins, no highway to flag down passing traffic. Just forest and darkness and whatever was moving through it. I made myself ease off the accelerator, brought the speed down to something reasonable, focused on the narrow cone of light from my headlights rather than the darkness pressing in from all sides. The drive to pavement took 45 minutes on a normal day. Tonight it felt like hours, every minute stretching into eternity as I navigated the winding road that seemed narrower than before, more enclosed, the trees reaching across overhead to form a tunnel that might never end. When I finally hit the county highway, I wanted to weep with relief. Pavement, lines painted down the center, a sense of civilization that felt like salvation. I drove straight to the ranger station in Drummond even though it was past 9 o'clock, and the office was closed and dark. I parked in the lot and sat there with the engine running, staring at the building's familiar outline, trying to decide what to do next. I could call Janet, tell her I'd seen something at the cabin, something I couldn't explain. She'd listen because that's what she did, would take my report seriously because she trusted my judgment. But then what? What would I tell her? That I'd seen some kind of massive bipedal creature watching me from the tree line? That it moved like nothing I'd ever encountered, possessed intelligence and intention that went beyond animal behavior? She'd think I was having a breakdown. Hell, maybe I was having a breakdown. Maybe the isolation really had gotten to me, made me see things that weren't there, warped my perception until normal became abnormal and shadow became substance. But I knew what I'd seen. Knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name, my own face in the mirror. This wasn't delusion or stress or isolation-induced hallucination. This was real, solid, existing in the world, whether I could explain it or not. I pulled out my phone, brought up Marcus's number, my thumb hovering over the call button. He was a scientist, trained in wildlife biology and zoology, someone who might have answers or at least frameworks for understanding. But what would I ask him? Whether there were any 8-foot bipedal predators documented in Wisconsin? Whether the impossible could somehow be possible? I put the phone away without calling, leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes. The image of that silhouette was burned into my vision, would be burned there forever, probably, added to the collection of things I wished I'd never seen. The shape of it, the proportions, the way it had moved, all of it added up to something my mind wanted to reject but couldn't. When I finally drove back to my cabin in Drummond, I left all the lights on, checked every window, made sure the doors were locked. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until exhaustion dragged me under sometime after 3, and my dreams were full of burnished gold eyes and silhouettes that moved with terrible purpose through darkness that pressed close enough to suffocate. The following weekend, just 7 days after seeing that silhouette, I told myself I wouldn't go back to the cabin. I'd spend Saturday in town, maybe drive down to Hayward, do anything that kept me in civilization where things made sense. But by Friday afternoon, I was loading tools into the truck bed, convincing myself that what I'd seen had been exaggerated by darkness and distance, that daylight would restore rationality to the whole situation. The drive north felt different this time. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hold potential threat. Every curve in the road a place where something might be waiting. I kept the radio turned up loud, letting classic rock fill the truck cab, drowning out the silence that tried to press in from outside. When I pulled into the clearing behind the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the wood pile I'd been building near the back door. It had been scattered, logs thrown in all directions. The neat stack I'd constructed, completely destroyed. Not collapsed, destroyed. The logs were spread across 20 feet of ground like they'd been deliberately hurled rather than simply toppled. I sat in the truck for 5 full minutes, staring at the scattered wood, telling myself it could have been a bear. They got into things, tore stuff apart looking for food or grubs or just because they could. But bears didn't arrange destruction in patterns, and there was something deliberate about how the logs had been thrown, something that suggested anger or maybe warning. I got out slowly, left the truck running, walked to the edge of the scattered wood. No tracks in the dirt this time, but the ground was harder now. Frost having settled in overnight and hardened the soil enough the tracks wouldn't register. I picked up one of the logs, a heavy piece of maple I'd split myself. Noticed the gouge marks along one side. 4 parallel lines, deep enough to have taken significant force to create. I ran my finger along the marks, felt where wood had been carved away. Tried to tell myself these were old marks, something I'd done with the axe or maul when splitting. But I knew my own work, and these weren't tool marks. These were claw marks, deep and deliberate, the kind of thing that required serious strength and serious intent. I dropped the log, backed toward the truck, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I'd driven 2 hours to get here, had told myself this whole situation was manageable, explainable, something I could handle with enough daylight and rational thought. So instead of leaving, I went inside, grabbed my toolbox and the boards I'd brought to patch some gaps in the foundation, told myself I'd work for a few hours and then head back to town well before dark. The cabin felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Nothing was obviously disturbed. My sleeping bag still rolled in the corner, my camping stove where I'd left it, supplies stacked against the wall. But there was a smell that hadn't been there before. Musk, heavy and animal. Something that made my hindbrain light up with alarm before my conscious mind could even process what it was detecting. I stood in the doorway, breathing through my mouth, trying to identify the scent, finally recognizing it as similar to wet dog, but heavier, wilder, mixed with something else I couldn't name. I should have left then. Every rational part of me knew that leaving was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept me alive and unharmed. But I'd spent 12 years as a ranger, had dealt with problem bears and aggressive wolves and every kind of wildlife situation Wisconsin could throw at me. I wasn't going to be driven off my own property by strange smells and scattered firewood. I spent the morning working on the foundation, crawling underneath the cabin to replace rotted boards, my head full of cobwebs and dust and the constant awareness that I was putting myself in an extremely vulnerable position. Every sound made me freeze. The creak of settling wood, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant calls of crows that had returned to the area. The silence I'd noticed earlier seemed to have lifted slightly, though not completely. There were still fewer birds than there should have been. Still an absence that felt more significant than simple migration. By noon, I'd finished the foundation work and moved on to clearing more brush from around the cabin perimeter. Uncle Ray had let the property go wild in his final years, and saplings had grown right up against the walls, their roots potentially damaging the structure. I worked methodically, using loppers to cut through branches, pulling the severed saplings away, and stacking them for burning later. I was dragging a particularly stubborn poplar sapling away from the back corner when I saw it through the window. Not the window of the cabin, the window of the old root cellar, a stone structure built into the hillside about 30 yards behind the main building. The window was small, barely 2 feet square, set high in the stone wall to let in light and air. And framed in that window, watching me with absolute stillness, was a face. The sapling fell from my hands. My entire body locked up, every muscle going rigid, breathing stopping entirely as my brain tried to process what my eyes were reporting. The face was huge, far larger than any wolf's skull, with a muzzle that extended forward in a shape that was somehow both canine and not. Black lips pulled back slightly to reveal teeth. Not fangs exactly, but something designed for tearing, for rending, for killing. The nose was broad and dark, wet-looking even from this distance, positioned above that elongated muzzle in a way that suggested it could track scent with terrifying efficiency. But it was the eyes that truly destroyed me. They were amber like I'd seen before, but now I could see the intelligence in them, the awareness, the focused attention of something that was actively studying me. Not the simple predator awareness of a wolf or bear, but something deeper, more complex. These were eyes that understood, that evaluated, that made decisions based on observation and analysis. And they were positioned above hands because I could see them now gripping the window frame from inside the cellar. And they weren't paws or claws, but actual hands with opposing thumbs and individual fingers, each tipped with a curved claw that dug into the old wood. The hands were covered in fur, coarse and grizzled, gray-brown like weathered bark. But the structure underneath was unmistakably human in configuration, even if the proportions were wrong, the fingers too long, the palm too broad. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Seconds, maybe, or minutes. Reality itself seemed suspended, my understanding of the possible colliding with this thing that violated every principle of that understanding. The creature, because that's what it was, not an animal, not anything that fit into normal taxonomic categories, shifted slightly in the window frame. I saw the movement of shoulders, massive and powerful, muscle moving under fur in a way that suggested strength far beyond human capability. The muzzle opened slightly and I saw more teeth, saw a tongue that was too long and too mobile, saw the roof of a mouth that was designed for consuming meat. Then it made a sound. Low, rumbling, somewhere between a growl and something else. Something that had vocal complexity suggesting language or at least communication. The sound carried across the 30 yards between us and hit me like a physical force, resonating in my chest, triggering every prey instinct hardwired into my DNA. I ran. No conscious decision, no weighing of options. My body simply took over and I ran for the truck. Legs pumping, lungs burning. Certain with absolute conviction that if I looked back, I would see it coming after me. That massive form crossing the distance with impossible speed. I reached the truck and threw myself inside, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine cranked once, twice. Nothing. I flooded it, I realized, my foot jamming the accelerator in panic. I forced myself to wait, to count to 3 while every cell in my body screamed to run and tried again. The engine caught. I reversed out of the clearing in a spray of gravel and dead leaves and saw movement in my peripheral vision. It was coming around the side of the cabin, not running but loping with that terrible efficiency, cutting the angle toward my truck. I slammed the transmission into drive before I'd fully stopped reversing, heard the gears grind in protest, and floored it. The truck fishtailed on the frost-slick ground, tires spinning for one heart-stopping moment before they caught. The 2-track leading out was too narrow to build real speed. In the mirror, I could see it behind me, keeping pace for maybe 50 yards before it slowed, stopped, let me go. But this time, the escape had been narrow. Seconds, maybe less. It had almost reached the truck before I'd gotten moving. Only when I reached the seasonal road did I allow myself to breathe. The clearing behind me was empty now. The cabin sat peaceful and quiet in the afternoon sunlight, the root cellar visible beyond it, the small window dark and apparently unoccupied. But I knew what I'd seen, knew it with cellular certainty, with the kind of knowledge that bypasses rational thought entirely and settles directly into bone and blood. I made it halfway back to the highway before I had to pull over, my whole body shaking with adrenaline crash. I sat on the shoulder with the hazards blinking, head between my knees, breathing in gasping gulps until the nausea passed, and I could think semi-clearly again. It had been inside the root cellar, not just near my property, not just passing through. It had been inside a structure on my land, watching me from 30 yards away. And the way it had studied me, the focused intensity of that gaze, suggested this wasn't its first visit. Maybe the root cellar was just an observation post, somewhere it could watch the cabin without being seen, which meant its actual den was somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the forest, somewhere I hadn't found yet. The personal violation of that realization hit me almost as hard as the initial terror. This thing, whatever it was, had claimed my property as its territory, had been observing me, learning my patterns, maybe going through my belongings when I wasn't there. The scattered woodpile took on new meaning, not random destruction, but deliberate message, a warning or maybe a taunt. Look what I can do. Look how close I can get. I pulled back onto the road, drove another 5 miles, pulled over again because my hands were still shaking too badly to drive safely. I needed to call someone, report this, get help. But who? What would I even say? I imagined calling Janet. Hey, there's an 8-foot-tall wolf man living in my root cellar. She'd send someone to check on me, sure, but not to investigate a creature. They'd be checking on my mental state, my stress levels, whether I needed to take some time off or maybe see a counselor. I imagined calling Marcus. Remember those tracks I sent you? Well, I found what made them. He'd ask for photos, evidence, documentation, none of which I had because I'd been too busy running in terror to think about gathering proof. I imagined calling Ray's old hunting buddies, the ones who knew the deep woods, who'd spent decades in these forests. There's something out at Ray's old cabin, something that shouldn't exist. And they'd nod and share stories about strange sightings and weird sounds. But none of them would actually do anything because what could you do? Call in the DNR to hunt an animal that violated every known principle of wildlife biology? The sun was getting lower, shadows lengthening across the road, and I realized I was sitting on a lonely stretch of gravel with darkness coming on, and whatever had been watching me from that window still out there somewhere. I forced my hands to steady, forced my breathing to normalize, and drove the rest of the way back to Drummond without stopping. But I didn't go to my cabin in town. I drove to the ranger station instead, parked in the lot, and sat there until I saw Janet's truck pull in for the evening shift change. She noticed me immediately, walked over with concern clear on her face. "Lachlan, you okay?" I wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to unload the whole impossible story, find some kind of relief in sharing the burden of knowledge. But looking at her familiar face, seeing the genuine concern and the assumption that whatever was wrong would be something she could help fix, I couldn't do it. "Just needed to see a friendly face," I said instead. "Cabin's getting lonely." She studied me for a long moment, and I knew she didn't entirely believe me, but she let it go. "You should come to the barbecue tomorrow," she said. "Whole crew's getting together at Miller's place. Good food, good people. Better than sitting out in the woods by yourself." I agreed because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't handle being around people right now, why the thought of making small talk and pretending everything was normal felt impossible. She gave my shoulder a squeeze and headed inside, and I sat in the truck for another hour, watching the sky fade from blue to purple to black, trying to decide what to do next. The rational options were limited and unsatisfying. I could stop going to the cabin, could abandon the whole project of fixing it up, could walk away and pretend the inheritance had never happened, or I could go back, armed this time, prepared to defend myself or maybe confront whatever was claiming my property as its territory. Or I could find some way to document what I'd seen, gather evidence that would force people to believe me, even if the explanation violated everything they thought they knew about reality. None of those options felt adequate. Walking away meant letting fear win, meant abandoning property that was legally mine, meant running from something I didn't understand. Going back meant deliberately putting myself in danger, and for what? To prove a point? To reclaim territory from something that had every physical advantage? And trying to document it assumed I'd get another chance to see it, that it would cooperate with being photographed or recorded, that I wouldn't just end up with more blurry images that could be explained away as shadows or known animals or digital artifacts. I drove home eventually to my actual home, the small cabin I rented in Drummond proper. I checked every window before bed, locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle for extra security, even though I knew that wouldn't stop anything truly determined to get inside. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, seeing that face in the root cellar window every time I closed my eyes, remembering the intelligence in those amber eyes, the deliberateness of its observation. Sleep came in fits and starts, full of dreams, where I was back at the cabin and it was circling, always just out of clear sight, but present, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake that would give it whatever opening it needed. I woke multiple times to phantom sounds, footsteps that weren't there, scratching at windows that revealed nothing when I checked, the sense of being observed that had no rational source. By morning, I was exhausted, strung out on adrenaline and fear and lack of real rest. I called in sick to work, and something I rarely did, and spent the day researching. I pulled up every database I had access to through the DNR, searched for any reports of unusual sightings or unexplained attacks. I found plenty of black bear incidents, some wolf encounters, even a few reports of cougars, though we weren't supposed to have breeding populations in Wisconsin. But nothing that matched what I'd seen, nothing even close. I expanded my search beyond official channels, started looking at cryptozoology forums and paranormal websites, the kind of places I'd normally dismiss as crackpot territory. And there I found stories that made my blood run cold. Sightings from across Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula, reports going back decades, witnesses describing creatures that matched what I'd seen, bipedal, massive, wolf-like but wrong, moving with intelligence and purpose. The reports were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications or attention-seeking, but reading them I recognized something in the descriptions, a consistency of detail that suggested actual observation rather than invention. One report from 1989 described an encounter near Iron River, Michigan, less than 100 miles from my cabin. The witness, a logger, claimed he'd seen a creature watching him from the edge of a clear cut, standing upright, easily 8 feet tall. He'd tried to photograph it, but his camera had malfunctioned. He couldn't explain how or why, just that the whole mechanical system had frozen. When he looked up from the camera, the creature was gone, vanished into the forest without a sound, despite its size. Another report from 2003, this one from Mellon, Wisconsin, maybe 40 miles south of my location. A bow hunter in a tree stand claimed something had approached his position in the pre-dawn darkness, circling his tree, making vocalizations he couldn't describe. He said he'd watched it through his scope and seen something that made him abandon his stand and his expensive bow and run back to his truck. He never went into those particular woods again. The reports were scattered, separated by years and distance, but taken together they painted a picture of something that inhabited the deep forests of the upper Midwest, something that mostly avoided human contact, but occasionally let itself be seen, whether by accident or design, I couldn't tell. But the pattern was there once I started looking for it. I printed out everything I found, created a file that grew to 40 pages of sighting reports, blurry photographs, secondhand accounts. None of it would stand up to scientific scrutiny. It was all anecdotal, unverified, exactly the kind of evidence that got dismissed by serious researchers. But I wasn't trying to prove anything to the scientific community. I was trying to understand what I was dealing with, trying to find some framework for processing the impossible thing that had been watching me from my own root cellar. By late afternoon, I was staring at the accumulated research spread across my kitchen table, feeling both validated and more terrified than before. Because if these reports were genuine, if there really was something inhabiting the northern forests, then I'd stumbled into territory where normal rules didn't apply, where the isolation I'd always found peaceful was actually dangerous, where being alone in the woods meant being vulnerable to something that knew those woods far better than I ever would. My phone rang, making me jump. Janet's number. "Hey," she said when I answered. "Just checking on you. You never miss work unless something's really wrong." "Just a stomach bug," I lied. "Feeling better now?" "Good. Because I need to ask you something." Her tone shifted, became more serious. "Did you file any reports about unusual activity around your uncle's place?" My heart rate picked up. "No. Why?" "Got a call from a hiker this morning. Said they'd found a dead deer about a mile from your property line. Not usual predation. This thing had been torn apart, like seriously torn apart. They thought maybe a bear, but the ranger who responded said the damage didn't look right. Too much force, wrong pattern." I closed my eyes, saw that massive form in the window again, those hands with their curved claws. What did they do with it? Left it, nature taking its course and all that. But Lachlan, if you've seen anything weird out there, you need to report it. We might have a problem animal we need to track. Problem animal. The phrase was so inadequate it was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was funny. "I haven't seen anything," I said, and hated how easily the lie came, "but I'll keep an eye out." We talked for a few more minutes, Janet describing the barbecue I'd missed, trying to pull me into normal conversation. I played along because it was expected, because she was worried about me and I couldn't explain why her worry was justified without sounding insane. When we finally hung up, I sat staring at my phone, thinking about that dead deer, about the kind of strength required to tear apart an animal that size. It was killing on my property, or near enough. Hunting, feeding, making itself at home in territory that I'd foolishly thought was mine. The sun was setting again, shadows lengthening across my small yard. I checked the locks on my doors, verified the windows were secure, told myself I was being paranoid. I lived in town, surrounded by other houses, civilization close enough that I could yell for help and be heard. I was safe here, but I didn't feel safe. I felt watched, even here, even surrounded by humanity. Because I knew now what was out there, knew it was real and present and aware of me. And I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes in the window, the intelligence behind them, the way it had studied me with such focused intensity. I slept with the lights on that night and the night after and every night for the next week. And I didn't go back to the cabin. I told myself it had been 2 weeks, that whatever I'd seen had moved on to other territory, other hunting grounds. I told myself a lot of things during those 14 days of sleeping with every light on in my rental house, jumping at shadows, avoiding Janet's increasingly concerned phone calls. But the cabin sat out there with my tools, my generator, the personal items I'd brought from my ranger station apartment, things I'd need to retrieve eventually. And more than that, I needed to prove to myself I could go back, that I wasn't going to let fear drive me completely away from something I'd inherited, something that was supposed to be mine. That's what I told myself when I finally loaded my truck on a Saturday morning in mid-November, the sky low and gray with the promise of snow. That I was being rational, that I was taking precautions, my service weapon holstered on my hip, a high-powered flashlight, my radio even though I was probably out of range for it to do much good. That I'd go during full daylight, grab what I needed, and be back on the highway before dark. The lies we tell ourselves when we're trying to be brave. The drive took 40 minutes, the seasonal roads getting progressively worse as I moved deeper into national forest land. No other vehicles, no signs of human activity once I left the county highway. just endless trees pressing close on both sides, their branches bare and skeletal against the overcast sky. I'd made this drive dozens of times before without feeling anything but peaceful anticipation. Now every shadow looked threatening, every gap between trees, a place something could be watching from. The cabin appeared unchanged when I pulled into the clearing. Same weathered logs, same new roof I'd installed in September, same feeling of isolation that had once seemed appealing. I sat in the truck for a full 5 minutes, engine running, studying the tree line and the structure itself. Nothing moved. No sounds except wind through branches and the idle of my engine. I killed the ignition and the silence rushed in. It took everything I had to open the truck door, to step out into that clearing with my back exposed and the forest surrounding me. I kept one hand near my weapon as I approached the cabin, scanning constantly, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door was still locked. No signs of forced entry. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Tools on the workbench, sleeping bag on the cot, half-empty coffee mug I'd abandoned on the counter. I worked quickly, loading tools into plastic bins, grabbing clothes and supplies. I told myself I'd come back another time to deal with the bigger items, that this was just a first trip. But I knew even then I was lying. I was stripping the place, taking everything that mattered because some deep instinct understood I wouldn't be coming back again. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes when I heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of sound. That same held breath silence I'd noticed before. Like the forest itself was tensing. I froze halfway to the truck with a bin of tools, listening. Wind had stopped. No birds, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Just stillness so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. Then I saw the tracks. They crossed the clearing between me and my truck, fresh enough that frost still clung to the disturbed earth. The same 5-toed prints I'd photographed weeks ago, the same wrong proportions and impossible stride length. But these were deeper, clearer, made by something even heavier than I'd estimated. They led from the tree line straight to my truck, circled it completely, then headed toward the church. The church Uncle Ray had mentioned, the one I'd never found, never looked for, and had been trying not to think about since this whole nightmare began. Or what's idiotic, I should have gotten in the truck right then. Should have abandoned the tools, the supplies, everything, and driven straight back to Drummond. But I was so tired of being afraid, so exhausted from 2 weeks of sleeping with lights on and jumping at shadows, and some stupid part of me needed to understand, needed to see clearly what had been haunting my dreams and destroying my peace of mind. I followed the tracks. They led through the woods on a path I'd walked before, but everything looked different now, more threatening, shadows deeper. The gray daylight somehow failing to penetrate the canopy, even though most leaves had fallen. I kept my hand on my weapon, flashlight in the other hand, even though it was barely past noon. The temperature seemed to drop as I moved deeper into the trees, cold seeping through my jacket in a way that felt unnatural for November in Wisconsin. The church appeared through the bare branches like something out of a nightmare. The old Norwegian Lutheran chapel, its white paint, long since weathered to gray, the steeple partially collapsed, windows dark and empty. The door had been torn off its hinges and lay in the overgrown grass of what had once been a small cemetery, headstones tilted and crumbling. The tracks led straight to the entrance. I stopped maybe 30 yards away, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The building radiated wrongness, not the gentle decay of an abandoned structure, but something more active, more malevolent, like the church itself had been corrupted by whatever inhabited it, transformed from a place of worship into something else entirely. I could leave. Should leave. Get back to the truck, drive away, never come back to this property or this forest. Let whatever lived here have it. Let it hunt and kill and exist in whatever way it needed to, as long as it left me alone. But I couldn't move, because I heard something from inside the church, a sound like breathing, deep and steady, the rhythm of something large at rest. And beneath that, a lower sound I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. It was in there, right now, waiting. My hand found my weapon, drew it without conscious decision. I moved toward the church entrance, each step requiring effort, like wading through deep water. Later, I wouldn't be able to explain why I did this, why I chose confrontation over retreat. Maybe it was exhaustion from weeks of fear. Maybe it was some territorial instinct, claiming this was my property, my inherited land. Maybe I was just tired of running from something I couldn't understand. The interior was dark enough that I needed the flashlight, its beam cutting through shadows to illuminate wooden pews covered in debris, a collapsed altar at the far end, holes in the ceiling where the roof had failed. The smell hit me immediately. Musk and copper and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench. Old blood, I realized. Lots of it, soaked into the wooden floorboards in dark stains. The breathing sound was louder now, echoing off the walls. Coming from below, there was a door behind the altar, standing open, leading down to what I assumed was a basement or root cellar. The breathing came from there, steady and deep. And mixed with it, I heard a sound like claws on stone. Movement in the darkness below. I should have run then. Should have recognized that I'd gone too far, pushed too hard into territory where I didn't belong. But I was committed now, caught in that terrible momentum that carries you forward even when everything sensible says to retreat. I moved toward the basement door, flashlight extended, weapon raised, hands shaking so badly the light beam trembled. The stairs were stone, slick with moisture and something else. That same organic wrongness I smelled, thick in the air. I descended one step at a time, every nerve firing warnings my brain refused to process. The basement opened up into a larger space than the church footprint suggested, carved partially into rock, the ceiling lost in shadow above my flashlight beam. And there, in the center of that space, surrounded by bones, deer, smaller animals, things I couldn't identify, it sat watching me. The full sight of it hit me like a physical blow, my mind trying and failing to categorize what I was seeing into something explainable. 8 feet tall, even sitting, its body a mass of muscle covered in coarse fur that looked gray-brown in my flashlight beam. The torso was humanoid enough to be obscene. Broad shoulders, defined musculature, arms that hung to where its knees would be if it were standing. But the proportions were all wrong. Too heavy in the upper body, the arms too long and powerful, ending in hands that were something between human and wolf. 5 digits, including an opposable thumb, but each finger tipped with a curved black claw, easily 3 inches long. The legs were digitigrade, built for both bipedal locomotion and explosive power. the kind of musculature that could launch that massive body forward with terrifying speed. But it was the head that destroyed any remaining hope that this was some deformed bear or wolf. The skull was elongated, a muzzle full of teeth designed for tearing and crushing. But the shape was wrong. Too much cranium space, too much intelligence in the structure. The ears were pointed and mobile, tracking my smallest movement. And the eyes, those same amber eyes I'd seen reflecting my headlights, watched me with an awareness that was purely, terrifyingly human. It didn't move, didn't threaten or attack. It just sat there among its kills, studying me with the same focused intensity I'd felt through my root cellar door. And I understood in that moment that it had let me find it, had allowed me to follow its tracks straight here, had been waiting for me with the patience of a predator that knows exactly what its prey will do. I couldn't tell how long we stayed like that, locked in mutual observation, long enough for me to catalog every detail, every impossible aspect of the creature before me, long enough to accept that this was real, that I was standing in a basement with something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about biology and nature and the possible. Then it moved. Not an attack, not yet, just a shift of weight, rising from its sitting position with a fluid grace that something that size shouldn't possess. Standing at full height, it had to hunch slightly to avoid the ceiling, its head nearly brushing the stone. And I could see the intelligence in those eyes, the calculation, the awareness that it held every advantage and knew it. My flashlight beam trembled worse, throwing shadows across fur and muscle and teeth. My weapon felt completely inadequate, a child's toy against the massive predator in front of me. But I kept it raised anyway, kept the barrel pointed center mass, even as my hands shook. My finger found the trigger, but something stopped me, some deep instinct warning that the noise would provoke rather than protect, that I'd only be announcing my threat level was exactly as low as it suspected. Easy, I heard myself say, my voice barely above a whisper. Easy. Like it was a spooked horse, like speaking softly would somehow bridge the gap between us, establish communication with something that probably viewed me the same way I viewed a deer. Meat, an opportunity. It tilted its head, and I swear something that looked like amusement flickered in those molten copper eyes. Then it dropped to all fours, faster than my mind could process the movement, and the sound it made froze every muscle in my body. Not a howl or growl, but something between them, a vocalization that resonated in frequencies I felt in my bones, a warning and a promise and a challenge all at once. I ran. Up the stairs, my flashlight beam swinging wild, my weapon still in my hand but forgotten. Behind me, I heard it following. Not in any rush. The sound of claws on stone and then wood as it ascended the stairs. I burst out of the basement into the church's main floor, sprinting for the entrance, dodging around collapsed pews and debris. I made it outside into gray daylight and kept running, crashing through undergrowth toward where I'd left the truck. Behind me, I heard wood splintering. The church door frame, I realized, too small for it to pass through easily. It was tearing the structure apart rather than slowing down. My truck appeared through the trees, and I closed the distance at a dead sprint, legs burning, lungs screaming. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, keys already in my hand through some miracle of muscle memory. The engine turned over on the first try, and I slammed the transmission into gear, my foot hitting the accelerator before I'd even closed the door properly. Something hit the driver's side with enough force to crumple the door panel, metal shrieking. Through the window I saw it. Claws tearing through steel, that massive head filling my peripheral vision, teeth inches from my face. I aimed my weapon with my right hand while steering with my left and fired twice, the sound deafening in the confined space, my ears ringing. Saw fur and flesh react. Saw it recoil but not fall, not stop. I floored the accelerator and the truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the frost-hardened dirt of the clearing. For a terrible moment, I thought I wouldn't get traction. Thought I'd sit there spinning while it tore the door completely off. Then the tires caught and the truck shot forward, branches scraping the sides as I crashed through brush toward where the seasonal road should be. In the rear view mirror, I saw it standing in the clearing, those heated brass eyes tracking my retreat, and my last coherent thought before pure survival instinct took over was how something that size could have possibly stayed hidden, how it could exist in the 21st century without being documented and studied and explained. Then I hit the seasonal road and focused everything on driving, on navigating the rough track at speeds that threatened to blow out my tires or snap an axle. The truck shook and rattled, the damaged door barely hanging on its hinges, cold air pouring through the gap. I didn't slow down until I reached the county highway, didn't feel safe until I saw another vehicle, a logging truck heading south. Confirmation that I'd made it back to the human world. I drove straight to the ranger station in Drummond, my hands locked on the wheel, unable to make them relax even after I'd parked in the lot. It was late afternoon by then, the sky darkening toward early winter evening. I sat there shaking, my ears still ringing from the gunshots, the smell of cordite mixing with my own fear sweat. Janet found me there 20 minutes later. She took one look at my face, at the destroyed door panel, at the way I couldn't stop trembling, and guided me inside without asking questions. Got me coffee I couldn't drink, made me sit down in her office while she called someone. An ambulance arrived eventually. I couldn't track time properly, couldn't focus on anything but the replay of amber eyes and massive clawed hands tearing through steel. They took me to the emergency room in Ashland, treated me for shock and minor lacerations. From broken window glass I didn't remember happening. Asked questions I couldn't answer coherently. Janet stayed the whole time, hovering in that way that meant she was worried but trying not to show it. "What happened out there?" she finally asked when the doctors had finished and left us alone in the exam room. I looked at her. This woman who'd worked Wisconsin forests for 20 years, who'd trained me and dozens of other rangers in wilderness safety and wildlife behavior, who'd dedicated her life to protecting and understanding the natural world. And I knew exactly how I was attacked by an 8-foot werewolf at an abandoned church would sound. "Hit a bear," I said. "Came at the truck. Must have been protecting a kill site or cubs or something." Her eyes searched my face, and I knew she didn't believe me, but she also knew pushing wouldn't get her truth, just more elaborate lies. "You should file a report," she said quietly. "There might be a problem animal we need to track." "No," I said too quickly, too forcefully. "No report. I'm fine. It's fine." "Lachlan, I don't want to talk about it." My voice came out harder than I intended, desperate. Can you give me a ride back to get my truck tomorrow?" She studied me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant she made her decision. To let it go, to accept my lie, because the alternative opened doors neither of us wanted to walk through. "Yeah," she said finally, "tomorrow." But there was no tomorrow, not really. because I knew even then I wasn't going back for the truck, wasn't going back to the cabin or to Drummond or to the northern forests where I'd spent 12 years of my life. Some part of me recognized that what I'd seen in that church basement had broken something fundamental in my understanding of the world, and no amount of pretending otherwise would repair it. I stayed with Janet that night. She insisted, wouldn't take no for an answer, and lay awake in her guest room staring at the ceiling until dawn. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow looked threatening. And when I finally did sleep, my dreams were full of that unblinking predator gaze and teeth and the sound of wood splintering as something too large forced itself through a space too small. The next morning I told Janet I needed some time off. She didn't argue, just nodded and told me to take care of myself. I drove back to my rental house in my damaged truck. She'd had someone bring it to her place, and spent the next 3 days sitting on my couch, unable to make myself eat or sleep or function. On the 4th day, I called the DNR district office in Sturgeon Bay and asked if Peninsula State Park had any openings. The transfer happened fast, too fast probably, raising questions I didn't answer. I took a $12,000 pay cut to work tourist-heavy Door County shores, where the wildest things were drunk boaters and aggressive seagulls. Wondito sold the cabin to a developer sight unseen, refused to go back for my tools or the personal items I'd left there. Let them have it all. Let the forest reclaim whatever I'd abandoned. Better that than facing those woods again, than risking another encounter with something my mind still struggled to accept had been real. Janet stopped calling after a few weeks. Mutual unspoken agreement to not discuss what she suspected but couldn't acknowledge. My ex-girlfriend Rachel, who'd been talking about reconciliation before all this, ended things permanently when I refused to explain why I'd suddenly moved 4 hours south and wouldn't discuss the North Woods anymore. I watched that relationship die through text messages, too exhausted to fight for something that had probably been doomed anyway. Everyone I'd worked with, everyone who knew me as a competent ranger who loved the deep forests, they all got some version of the same story. Family issues, needed a change, wanted to be closer to civilization. The lies came easier each time I told them until I almost believed them myself. But the nights were harder. I moved into a second-floor apartment in Sturgeon Bay, where I could see the street from every window, where neighbors were close enough to hear me if I yelled. I stopped hunting, stopped camping, turned down any assignment that would take me north of Highway 29. The forest that had once been my sanctuary became places of active threat in my mind, territories I avoided with the same careful planning I'd once used to navigate them. My supervisor at Peninsula, a friendly woman named Karen who'd worked there 15 years, noticed I never volunteered for overnight wilderness patrols, never joined the other rangers for their weekend camping trips, never seemed comfortable if we had to work past dark. She asked once if something had happened at my previous posting. I told her I'd just gotten tired of the isolation, needed to be around people more. She accepted it because questioning further would have been inappropriate, but I saw the concern in her eyes. The first few months were the worst. Every unexpected sound made my heart race. Every shadow at dusk looked threatening. I slept with lights on, unable to handle complete darkness. The electric bill climbing to ridiculous heights. I'd wake from dreams of amber eyes and massive clawed hands, convinced I could hear something circling my apartment, heavy footfalls just beyond my door. My doctor diagnosed anxiety, prescribed medication I took religiously because it blunted the worst of the panic. But pills couldn't erase what I'd seen, couldn't logic away the knowledge that something existed in those northern forests that science hadn't documented and couldn't explain. I threw myself into work at Peninsula, leading nature walks and giving talks to school groups about safe wildlife, otters, eagles, white-tailed deer, animals that made sense, that followed known patterns of behavior, that posed manageable risks. I became the ranger everyone wanted for educational programs because I could make wildlife exciting without being threatening, could teach kids to respect nature without fearing it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes tourists would ask about wolves, about whether we had them in Door County. I'd explain their range, their behavior, their general avoidance of humans. All technically true, all completely inadequate for describing what lurked further north, in the deep forests where tourism rarely penetrated. I never went back to Drummond, never contacted Janet again, never tried to find out what happened to the cabin or the property or whether anyone else had encountered what I'd seen. Willful ignorance became my survival strategy. If I didn't look, didn't search for information, didn't think too hard about it, I could almost pretend it had been a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. 7 years have passed now. 7 years of working Peninsula's Nature Center, of living in Sturgeon Bay, of building a carefully constructed life that keeps me far from the deep wilderness. The medication helps, the routine helps, the distance helps most of all, but the fear never fully leaves. I still check my locks every night, still verify the streetlights are working, still feel my heart rate spike if I have to drive through forested areas after dark. And I still refuse any assignment that would take me north of Highway 29, into that territory where normal rules don't apply. My coworkers think I'm a little odd, but harmless. Karen stopped asking why I avoid certain situations, accepted it as personal quirk rather than trauma response. The tourists who attend my nature programs have no idea the man teaching them about local wildlife once stood in a church basement, face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still hunting those northern forests, still circling abandoned cabins and churches, still leaving tracks that people like me find and try desperately to explain away. I wonder if anyone else has seen it, has stood where I stood and felt that same terrible understanding that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we allow ourselves to believe. But I don't search for answers, don't read reports or follow up on sightings. Don't let myself think too hard about what might be happening in those forests I used to consider home. Because knowing didn't help me then, and it won't help me now. Some questions are better left unasked. Some territories better left unexplored. I'm safe here in Door County, surrounded by tourists and civilization and wildlife that makes sense. I have my second-floor apartment with its view of the street, my job giving educational talks about animals that follow known biological rules, my careful routine that keeps me far from the deep woods. It's a smaller life than I'd planned, smaller than I'd wanted, but it's a life I'm still living, which is more than I might have had if I'd made different choices that November day 7 years ago. And on nights when I wake to phantom sounds of heavy footfalls, when I have to check my locks and verify my windows and remind myself I'm far enough from the wilderness to be safe, I tell myself that's enough, that surviving is enough, that some prices are worth paying to escape with your life intact.